Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Andre and I'm your bookworm, and as you can see, completely different setup. I'm in Sydney at the moment. As I've been saying in the last couple of videos, I'm gonna be here for a couple more weeks, but I'm trying to just record reviews and get content out for you, and hopefully it all works out well. For now, we'll just have to extend with this. Not as pretty, but the content will still be out, so let's go for it. Today, the review that we have is for Northern Rat by Hilde Koldholt. I don't know if you remember, a couple of weeks ago I said that there was going to be a wave of Nordic fantasy coming into the channel. Well, this is the start of it. We're starting with Northern Rat by Hilde Koldholt. As I said, this is the first one of a trilogy called the Hang God Trilogy. And this is also the debut work for this author, so if you haven't ever heard of this, it's a bit normal. It's quite recent book as well, and I'm happy to introduce you to this world because this is just a tiny spoiler for what the review ahead. It's good. This is an epic fantasy series, like I said, heavily Nordic inspired, Nordic mythology and it was initially published in 2020. Since then, unfortunately, it hasn't gathered many reviews. On Goodreads, it has just over 700, so it haven't even hit 1,000 reviews. And the average score it has is of 3.91. Again, not that high, but with so few reviews, I would reckon if we got up to 10,000, it could have changed completely. So hopefully this review will make it reach out to a few more people, and maybe the result will change, who knows. I wish I could show you the edition I have of this book. I have the special edition done by The Broken Binding. It was part of their subscription for fantasy, and the cover art, the end papers, everything looks really epic. And one of the things I like the most is the spine, not the spine, but the edges are layered with a drawing that together with the three books forms a tree. And there is an important tree in this book as well. And I think it's a big staple of fantasy, having this big magical tree that is responsible for a lot of things. It's a good trope that I enjoy, so having those details in the book is really, really good. I'm going to put some images of the special editions going by, but I don't have it to show it here, but you can see through these images. But anyways, if you're new to the channel, you don't know the drill, I'm gonna read the synopsis to you. If you don't want to hear anything about it, just skip to the timestamp and we'll start right away into the review of it. Otherwise, if you're curious to know what this book is about, first of all, then stick around and I'll narrate it for you. A dead man walking between the worlds foresees the end of the gods. A survivor, searching for a weapon, releases a demon from fiery Muspelheim. A village is slaughtered by Christians, and revenge must be taken. The bonds between the gods and Midgard are weakening. It is up to Hilda, Ragnar, their tribesmen Einar and Finn, the chief's wife Siv, and Tyra, her adopted daughter, to fight to save the old ways from dying out and to save their gods in the process. And that's it. It's a pretty succinct synopsis, so it doesn't reveal much. It also just gives you a tiny bit of what's to come. I think it's a good balance. But yeah, that's it. So because we don't have any other scores to review, let's just jump into the review. I've been saying review, but let's jump into the first category, which is plot. As you can guess from the synopsis, if you heard it, if you didn't, then there's a good cast of characters. There's several POVs that you follow throughout the book, and they all come from the same village up north. And when I say up north, I'm mentioning more like North Europe, and this is because this book seems to be set in our world. Since they are Christians, they seem to be the equivalent to Vikings, and like there's no particular mention of specific cities. I mean, there are some names of towns and everything, but nothing that I can pinpoint directly, oh, okay, this is this city in Europe. So it does feel more towards our world than a completely fantastical world. But the thing is, at the same time, gods and magic are real. So we have this magical realism type of genre going on here, but I would let you know that it has a heavy emphasis on the magic. So don't expect this to be mostly a historical fiction with a tiny bit of magic into it. No, it's actually quite the other way around. And that I'm telling this by experience, because initially when I started reading this book, I didn't know anything about it. And when I started, I thought, oh, I wasn't expecting this to be a historical fiction. And that's okay. There are some good historical fiction books, but that's not really the genre that I go for most of the time. So when I was reading it, I was feeling okay. It's like, oh yeah, it's okay, but it's not really my thing. However, as I kept progressing and the magic kept going in and kept involving more of the world, then I started getting a lot more excited for it. And I think that as the fantasy part of this book started developing, so did the plot, which was a good way to get the plot to be more involved, to have more twists and more questions and mysteries to be answered. I personally enjoy Nordic mythology, so when I started realizing that we were going to have a heavy influence of this into the book and that there were actually going to be almost there, like the gods and the parts of this mythology, then I started feeling really excited about the plot. The thing that I have to say is, if you've played God of War, Ragnarok, or basically the God of War games that are set in the Nordic mythology, I think this plot will remind you heavily of it. Not due to the similarities, I don't think they are very similar, but more because of the feel that it brings. And the atmosphere and the twists are just as good. They're not identical whatsoever, it's not the same story, but the feeling is very similar. So for this category, I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 5. What about our characters? Since we have such a diverse cast of characters, there will always be some that you enjoy more than others. Kind of like in Game of Thrones, how you'll always like to follow one character more than others, and that's perfectly fine. One thing that I did not expect was, as I progressed through the book, my opinion about the characters started changing. So, for example, Hilda was a character that I was not enjoying whatsoever at the start, because I felt that it was a very brute stereotype that didn't have a lot of depth. But as the book progressed, she started evolving so much, and I felt like she was going through a beautiful arc of development of her own character. Whereas Civ, for example, I was very, very invested in her at the start, and then as the book progressed, it started fizzling out, and by the end, she was just some character that I wasn't really that much interested in reading on. I think it's still well written. I think the character is written well and it has a good development, but the development isn't really pulling me into reading more about them. I think Hilda, on the other way, was the other way around. It was very well, it didn't seem well written at the start, but it became really well written, and the journey they went through was really good. I am expecting a lot of this category for the next books. For now, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5, simply because I do think that the start of it, the characters could have been a bit better, so they didn't look so much as just stereotypes and almost badly written ones. Continuing to world building, as I mentioned at the start, I was very deluded thinking that I had jumped into a historical fiction book. But Tilda Cold started weaving a fantastical world into the tapestry that is this story. And she put the Nordic mythology and our world so well together, so seamlessly, that it felt like a natural progression. We were just slowly entering into this fantastical world, and it didn't feel like a sudden change in gears. And I don't know how much research she's done for this project, but it did feel like she had done quite a lot, and it felt very well researched. But then again, I'm not an expert in Vikings or Nordic mythology. I know a bit, but it's mostly from culture that is all around and from seeing a bit of Googling between like what god is what and runes and things like that. So not an expert, just saying that it did feel well researched. And when I say that it felt very well researched, I mean things like the culture of the people in the north parts of Europe, the names of towns, for example, their customs, all of these things seem to be coherent and concordant with what I know of our world. And the other thing that I thought was quite good was the way Hildegard Holt was able to describe and characterize not only our world, but the other worlds. Since we're looking into the Nordic mythology, there's 9 worlds, and I think the ones we've explored seemed very good and real, in the sense that just like we explore them in God of War, it does feel like I was almost exploring in the same way. So for this category, I'm gonna give it a 5 out of 5. Now let's talk about writing style. I was pleasantly surprised with the prose because, again, this is a debut work. I was expecting maybe to have some more incongruous sentences or something that would pull me out a bit more of the story, but it was actually quite good. And I think the prose relies a lot on the descriptions of the world around it to create the ambience, and I think that was done very well, because wherever we would go, I would know how the world around that character looked like. I think maybe the dialogue wasn't as smoothly as it could have been. There were some lines that felt a bit clunky, but overall it was still positive. And as for pacing, I think the pacing was also good. Okay, that at the start it started a bit slow and it took a bit to pick up things, especially so that the fantastic part of the story started getting into it. But I understand, because if we go on super fast, then when the fantastic parts get in, then it might feel very sudden and people might not be expecting. And I think actually that might be one of the reasons this book doesn't have a better score, because people are coming in thinking, starting to read. At first, the ones that read the synopsis may think this is a fantastic book, but then start thinking that this is historical fiction, and then they don't reach far enough to get to the fantastic parts. Whereas others maybe don't read the synopsis, start reading this book, think it's historical fiction, and then suddenly the fantastic parts come in and they feel that it's very incongruous. So having a slow start was good, even though of course it's not as pleasant for me as a reader, but I think for a reread it might have been better. But aside from that, I think action scenes were good. The sad scenes were very sad. I think all of them have the right punch into it. So for this category, I'm gonna give a 4 out of 5. And our last category is enjoyment. I think if this book had retained its form of historical fiction, or if it had stayed as a like in that genre, my enjoyment would have plummeted to maybe a 2 or a 3. But thankfully, the fantastic part of the book joined the chat, and boy oh boy was it fun. I think as I kept reading the book, my enjoyment kept growing and growing. And once I was fully immersed into it and the fantastic parts were all around, I was just wanting to read more and more and more and find the excuses to read it. I think it was a great read, despite, like I said, some details that might not have been to my full taste. I think it's just a read that I truly enjoyed, and it's unfortunately that for me, John Gwynn's series isn't as good, or it doesn't appeal to me in the same way as this one did. So for me, this enjoyment category gets a 5 out of 5. And so we reach the end of our review. Just as a refresher, we have 5 for plot, 4 for characters, 5 for world building, 4 for writing style, and 5 for enjoyment, which gives us a final score of 4.6 out of 5. I know, it's quite different from the Goodreads score. And like I said, I think the only reason for people to give a lower score on Goodreads is mostly what I said. The start is very different from once the book gains its hold. But I think it's a very good book for a debut author. I think if you enjoy reading, and if you enjoyed playing God of War Ragnarok and that whole series, then I think you'll enjoy this book as well. And I think it's a book that I would totally recommend. And again, if you haven't played God of War, but you do like Nordic mythology, then I would recommend this book again, because it is heavily inspired into it. There's a lot of elements into it. So I reckon you would have a good read. And I mean, I am very keen to read the second book of this series. My reading has been very slow while I'm here in Sydney because I've been very busy with work and catching up, but I cannot wait to read the second book. But let me know, what do you think? Have you read this book? Have you not? Are you curious not to read it? Comment down below. And if you're new, don't forget, subscribe, like the content, and I shall be seeing you soon. Hopefully I can keep publishing content at the normal rate, but if you see some delays, you know the reason. It's just very chaotic around here, but eventually we'll go back to the normal schedule, okay? Meanwhile, have good reads, and I'll see you soon. See ya!